If you're joining us on the live stream, you can find the handout on our website. For those of you in here, they are printing. So we had a little bit of a technical difficulty with the printer. Tried to print them yesterday, but they weren't ready. So we're printing them now, and when they're in here, then I'll signal somebody to pass them out, and you can have a handout in front of you if you would like. But we are in, as the screen says, Lamentations 4 and 5. As Brian said in the announcement, this is really the end, not necessarily today, but this week is the end of this quarter of classes and the end of our marathon through Jeremiah Lamentations. So by Wednesday, we'll have had 50 classes on these two books, and man, it kind of feels, in some ways it feels good to be done. It's kind of like, a long race or a long hike, you feel accomplished when you're finished. But we'll finish Lamentations today. We'll try to get through 4 and 5. And then Wednesday, we'll do some sort of mega review. So it won't be as fun because it will be virtual. I won't get to quiz you, while you're in here, get you to answer questions. But I'll put together some sort of printed or written review so you can look at and have to fill out. And then we'll do some sort of review reflection on Wednesday. And then Philippians will start in here on Sunday. And so I think Steve had sent out an email last week about reading the book regularly. So he said that he and Muffy are reading Philippians every day in preparation for this class coming up beginning of September. And he encouraged all of us to do that as well. So I would say, I think Philippians, it's like 20 minutes to get through the whole thing, right? And so make that your goal, to read Philippians every day leading up to Steve's class. And he's also going to be, like we've been doing, putting handouts on the website so that you can be preparing for class each Sunday as well. Okay, so Lamentations 4, and Robert has handouts. So if you would, he and Steve are going to pass them out. If you don't want them to hand you something, just wave them away and they won't give you anything. But they have handouts for you for Lamentations 4 and 5. And let's jump in. So we'll do them one at a time. So Lamentations 4 will begin. Remember, all of these chapters in Lamentations are separate poems. And so we'll start with Lamentations 4. And as we read, we'll read the whole thing, all 22 verses. And as we read, think about these things. The first thing I'll ask you is something we've kind of seen in each of these poems. And basically just asking you to think, as we read, how is the imagery describing? What is the poetic description here of what has happened to Jerusalem? What's the description like of Jerusalem and God's people after all of this, the tragedy of the destruction of Jerusalem? How is all that described in this poem? But ask yourself this as we go through: who's responsible for what has happened? Who's responsible for this? And we've talked about the kind of darkness of Lamentations as a whole, the despair of these poems. So ask yourself as we go through Lamentations 4, what is the hope, if any, that is expressed in this poem? So with those questions in mind, let's read through Lamentations 4. We'll read the whole thing, and then discuss these a little bit together, and then go through the verses and point out a few things. Lamentations 4. How dark the gold has become, how the pure gold has changed. The sacred stones are poured out. At the corner of every street, the precious sons of Zion, weighed against fine gold, how they are regarded as earthen jars, the work of a potter's hand. Even jackals offer the breast, they nurse their young, but the daughter of my people has become cruel, like ostriches in the wilderness. The tongue of the infant cleaves to the roof of its mouth because of thirst. The little ones ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. Those who ate delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those reared in purple embrace ash pits. For the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hands were turned toward her. Her consecrated ones were purer than snow. They were whiter than milk. They were more ruddy in body than corals. Their polishing was like lapis lazuli. Their appearance is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin is shriveled on their bones. It is withered it has become like wood. Better are those slain with the sword than those slain with hunger, for they pine away, being stricken for lack of the fruits of the field. The hands of compassionate women boiled their own children. They become food for them because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. The Lord has accomplished his wrath. He has poured out his fierce anger. He has kindled a fire in Zion, which has consumed its foundations. The kings of the earth did not believe, nor did any of the inhabitants of the world, that the adversary and the enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. Because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who have shed in her midst the blood of the righteous. They wandered blind in the streets. They were defiled with blood, so that no one could touch their garments. Depart, unclean, they cried of themselves. Depart, do not touch. So they fled and wandered. Men among the nations said, they shall not continue to dwell with us. The presence of the Lord has scattered them. He will not continue to regard them. They did not honor the priests. They did not favor the elders. Yet our eyes failed. Looking for help was useless. In our watching we have watched for a nation that could not save. They hunted our steps so that we could not walk in our streets. Our end drew near. Our days were finished. For our end had come. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles of the sky. They chased us on the mountains. They waited in ambush for us in the wilderness. The breath of our nostrils, the Lord's anointed, was captured in their pits, of whom we had said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, who dwells in the land of Uz. But the cup will come around to you as well. You will become drunk and make yourself naked. The punishment of your iniquity has been completed, O daughter of Zion. He will exile you no longer, but he will punish your iniquity, O daughter of Edom. He will expose your sins. Okay, let's do the second and third of these questions I asked you, and then we'll come back to the first one in just a moment. But who's responsible according to chapter 4? What are some of the things the poet says that would point to the responsibility in this poem? The sin of the Israelites, Brian says. What else would you say from chapter 4 here? The priests, Steve says. Where is that? Yeah, verse 13. Because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests. We've seen this before, right? We talked about that quite a bit in Jeremiah. Both this, the general sin of the people that Brian points out, as well as the specific sins of the priests and the prophets. So we see both of those here in Lamentations 4. And then what about the third of these questions? Is there any hope expressed in this poem here? Okay. Brian pointed out that the punishment is spoken of in the past tense here. Okay. Other observations, Ian? Okay, 21, to you also the cup shall pass. And who's being addressed in verse 21? Yeah, the enemy, right? Edom specifically, as Albert says, those who overtook them, they will receive the punishment. So there is that, there is a statement of hope. And then even in the next verse, what is said of Zion in particular? This is actually to Brian's point. Yeah, there's a completion there. As Lee points out, your exile, you'll keep you in exile no longer. Your punishment has been completed. ED, you know. So the end of the chapter points to the destruction of the enemies, punishment of the enemies, as well as the kind of cessation of punishment against God's people. Okay. So picture of destruction, which we'll talk more about in a second. Responsibility on the leaders of the people, spiritual leaders of the people, as well as the people in general. But a hope, not as explicit of a hope as in chapter 3, right? Great is your faithfulness, your steadfast love endures forever, all that. He'll have compassion on you. Not that explicit, but in chapter 4 here we do have an indication of hope. So let's talk about, especially at the beginning, the first 11 verses really work with this kind of contrast between the way things were and the way things are now. What do you see in there? Just shout out some things, maybe a verse number and a description of how things were in the past compared to the way they are now. What do you see? Yeah, the gold has lost its luster, Albert says. It's dulled. It's not what we thought it was or what it used to be. That's in verse 1. What else do you see has changed in Zion, Robert? Yeah. It seems to me a picture, and Robert points out 7 and 8, and it seems to me a picture of the elites, right? The fair skin, they got their jewelry, right? They're nice and kind of groomed, and they've been inside, right, their whole life, okay? And now they are starving, burnt, shriveled, and unrecognizable with the description in verse 8. Other contrasts you see, the then and now. Yeah, verse 5. Again, I think the elites, the royals. That's what the purple would entail. Now they're wrapped up in ashes or just laying down in the streets or something like that. Brian? Yeah, verse 2, it's interesting because he starts with the gold has been dimmed, but then he uses that, and I can just we're getting some of them now, so I'll throw them here. Verse 1 is the gold is contaminated. Verse 2 is the sons of Zion who were more precious than gold. Now they are like earthen jars, clay pots just been thrown out in the street. So you see how he starts with one image of material things and then uses that image to say the really precious things, the sons, are now, trash, basically, thrown out. Okay. Other things before we go on here? What is it? Milk? Yeah. I think that's the next one. The jackals, the cruelty of the people. So in verse 3, even wild animals, jackals will nurse their young, but now the situation has gotten so bad in Jerusalem that even the women are cruel, like ostriches. I guess that's like a reference to ostriches burying their eggs, which seems cruel. I guess we maybe have a reason for that now that we've studied ostriches, but maybe they appear to be cruel animals in the wild. But the point is that the little ones are neglected. The royal children lying in the streets, the fair-skinned nobles, shriveled and starving, and then to the point of the starvation, we have the women boiling and eating their own children, which you remember that happened a few times in Israel's history, or at least there are several references to it. Remember that I think we pointed out last time that in Deuteronomy 28, I believe, there's a section about this saying, when you forsake the covenant, it's going to become terrible. Your city will be sieged, there'll be starvation, and your parents will eat your children in the city. And then there's a story of Elisha that we talked about somewhat recently in 2 Kings chapter 6, I believe. That story begins and says that there were women eating their children. The siege had gotten so bad in Samaria. But this is the horrible situations that's described. And so again, we ask why, and the two things that have already been said is what we find in this section. I don't know why that says 7 to 9. That should say verse 6. But the iniquity of the daughter of my people, verse 6, is greater than the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hands turned toward her. Okay? The people, sinful, worse than Sodom, even, he says, which is hard to imagine, but that's the case. And then because of that, verse 11, God has accomplished his wrath. So I see verse 11 in some ways as the concluding statement of this first half of the poem, that after all these descriptions of how terrible things have become, the horrible present contrasted with the past, why, verse 11, the Lord has accomplished his wrath, poured out his fierce anger, and kindled a fire in Zion and consumed its foundations. Okay, other comments or questions just on these first 11 verses in Lamentations 4? Okay, so we keep going, and verse 12 makes the interesting statement that the fall of Jerusalem was an amazement, a wonder, even to the people of the world, the kings of the earth, it says, and the inhabitants. Didn't even think that Jerusalem could fall. That's a puzzling statement, and is maybe worth noting that there are times in Israel's history where other peoples made these kinds of statements or had this kind of attitude of like, man, the God of the Israelites is untouchable, But you'll remember Rahab said that in Joshua 2, that after hearing of the Red Sea and the defeat of the peoples in the wilderness, she said that the people of Jericho were trembling in fear because of this God who was leading these people into Canaan. 1 Samuel 4, the Philistines are terrified when the Israelites bring the ark into battle. Of course, that was a mistake for the Israelites to do that, but still the Philistines in their pagan thinking thought, oh no, their God's going to defeat us. And then some other, occasions like that. Maybe most recently to this time, remember that, speaking of Jerusalem in particular, 185,000 Assyrians were struck dead outside the gates of Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah when they tried to besiege and attack Jerusalem. So even just think about that, and maybe word got out. And so even the nations around thought, man, Jerusalem, there's no way that city's ever going to fall. But it did. It was destroyed. And again, we would say the priests and the prophets are the ones responsible for that. Think about what's said. We mentioned that in passing earlier, but look at these verses here in verses 13 to 16 and think specifically about the responsibility of the priests and prophets. Verse 13 says that it's because of the sins of her prophets, the iniquities of her priests, who have shed in her midst the blood of the righteous. What do you think the poet means by that when he says that the priests and the prophets have shed the blood of the righteous in their midst? Maybe we'd say, what are some possibilities of what he might mean by that? Yeah. So I'm going to summarize these and then let Robert jump in before I forget. Michael talks about the lying of the prophets that we've seen in Jeremiah, peace, peace, when there is no peace, and that kind of allows everyone to think everything's okay when there's really destruction at the gates. Brian brings up the point, suggests that there's a literal meaning to this of the injustice of the judicial system, even that is, punishing the innocent and letting the guilty walk, as well as maybe the priests, the prophets, not indicating the punishment. And then Albert says something similar, I think, to what Michael said about the priests and the prophets not facing up to the problem, and so the destruction that God brought on them, they are responsible for allowing that to happen without intervening as their office would require them to. Robert, you want to? So Robert brings up the actual slaying of the men of God that we see all throughout Israel's history, from Ahab all the way on through. And Jesus talks about that. There's a great passage where Jesus talks about you shed the blood of the prophets from Abel to Zechariah, which is like perfect because in English that's like A to Z, when he's really probably referring to a chronological. There's a prophet named Zechariah who is killed at the end of 2 Chronicles, which is the last book of the Hebrew Bible. And so Jesus is probably saying, from the first book of the Bible, Abel, to the last book, you've just been killing God's people and shedding their innocent blood. And so maybe that's in view here too. But I think this is helpful, and I think all of those contributions are beneficial. Because it's helpful to us to understand this idea of righteousness and injustice, and both sides of that there is an active injustice and I think Brian maybe points out this, that when justice is perverted, when you let the guilty walk, okay, you actively turn a blind eye to people that are doing wrong, okay, and you then take advantage of, or you oppress people who are innocent, but you can get something out of them. So that there's this kind of active type of injustice, active type of oppression that you see. And we need to be, watching out for that. That kind of thing still happens. And if we're not careful, we can find ourselves taking advantage of people in our lives because they're weaker, because they can't, speak up for themselves or defend themselves. And so there's an active sort of injustice. But there's also this kind of passive, because they didn't do what they were supposed to do, they allowed injustice to happen and therefore are responsible for the blood of the innocent. Several of the comments got to that as well. Whether it's not speaking out, and so injustices continue to occur in their society. The priests and the prophets supposed to be the leaders of the not just the courts, but also just the spiritual leaders in society, and they let these things happen, or even God's punishment coming upon them, and the priests and the prophets were supposed to warn the people, but they didn't, and so they're responsible. So it's interesting. I think that there's lots to be gained from both the active and maybe we would say passive injustice that is being committed. But the description of these holy men, this is interesting in 14, 15, and 16. These holy men, we would think of them, they are unclean, defiled with blood in verse 14. But notice verse 15, I think what's being described here, I couldn't find this in Leviticus, but I remember this, whether it's somewhere or this just kind of tradition that's passed on, that lepers were supposed to walk around, keeping their distance from people, covering their face and saying, unclean, unclean. I think that seems to be what's being described here. The prophets and priests now, they have this kind of outcast status. They're lost, they're wandering, they're rejected and scattered across the nations, and God has sent them out, and other people don't even accept them. So you see these people. And again, you could make the connection to ourselves. We are called on to be priests, holy to the Lord. We are supposed to fill in our lives a very similar role of those that are speaking God's word as the prophets did, those who are supposed to be mediating, helping to bring people to God, teaching people about God's word so that they can know and avoid the punishment. And if we shirk our responsibility, then we as the holy people of God can do what was done here, failing to fulfill our responsibility and becoming responsible for other people. That was what Ezekiel was told. Remember, Ezekiel was told, you're a watchman. If you speak and they don't listen, then you're not responsible, right? But if you don't speak and they're destroyed, then you are responsible. And that's a sobering thought. Steve? Sure. Yeah, so Steve brings up this very good observation about the use of religion to do evil things, the guise of religion, Steve says, that under which people do commit wickedness, even murder, throughout history. And it's taking place here, and it's a lesson for us to say we need to be careful that we're not trying to use this kind of guise of the truth to oppress, to hate, to commit wickedness, even within our hearts towards other people. And that's not necessarily Steve's explicit point, but when he was saying it, I thought maybe these are the kinds of passages we can take people to that have a problem with religion and say, oh, well, religion is just, it's excuse, it's a club for people to do horrible things, beat people over the head, and it's an excuse to do all kinds of atrocities. You could take people even to the Bible and say, well, even the Bible describes people doing that, but that's not, what God intended. So, Brian, and then we'll move forward here. That's right. So Brian mentions the warning of God from the beginning, literally from the beginning of the covenant, to say this is what happens if you disobey. And the priests and the prophets, they're the ones that knew this stuff. They knew the Deuteronomy, for instance, and yet they failed to warn and to instruct as they should have. And so the result is, in the rest of this poem here in chapter 4, the people are left helpless. Okay, there's two things mentioned in these verses that we've already talked quite a bit about, so we won't belabor the point. Two things that they tried to trust in but couldn't help them. Verse 17, other nations like Egypt, we remember that wasn't going to help them. And then in verse 20, the Lord's anointed. Who's that? It's being spoken of. Who's the Lord's anointed? Well, more specifically, in the time, right? In the time of Lamentations, he says, the Lord's anointed. Remember, the king, the Lord's anointed, the king, and the rest of that verse helps us with the context here. Under his shadow we will live among the nations. The king was supposed to protect them and keep them safe. But you remember the end of Jeremiah in chapter 52, Zedekiah, was running for the hills when the Babylonians, invaded, and he was caught and captured. So other nations couldn't help them. The king couldn't save them. It was on the screen, and he still couldn't. No, I'm just kidding. All right, and then as we said, verse 21 and 22, this is, if there's hope in this poem, this is where it is, that Edom rejoices. The enemy of God is gloating over what is happening to Israel. And yet the final word of the poem is God's people will be saved when God relents from his punishment. But Edom will be exposed, and Edom, representative of the enemies of God, will be punished. Real quickly, I couldn't help but think that in verse 22 there was something encouraging for us about that the enemies of God will be exposed. Steve, the song that Steve had us sing at the end of his sermon, powerful on top of what he said, is a great way to conclude those thoughts. But I was thinking, and even related to some of the things he said in the sermon about contrasting the perfection of God's world as it was made with the evil that we see. And that line in that song that, this is my Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrong seems off so strong, God is the ruler yet. It's really hard to see so much evil taking place. But in preparing and thinking about Lamentations 4:22, that Edom will be exposed. There is coming a day when all the evil will be exposed for what it is. And maybe combine that with Romans 8, and the sons of God will be revealed. Wickedness will be exposed. Those faithful to God will be revealed to be faithful, and will be rewarded and redeemed in their faithfulness, and everything will be set right. And so there's hope even in that, in the exposing and the punishing of wickedness. Okay, let's keep going, and remember that we had this kind of 5-part collection in Lamentations, and remember that they all form this acrostic pattern. Chapter 3 being the centerpiece as the longest of the 5 poems, but chapter 5 doesn't. Okay, so chapter 5 is written a little bit differently. It's about the same length, but there's no acrostic pattern, and it seems to be intentionally placed at the end. So let's read chapter 5 and notice the pain of the people. See if you can't just sympathize, empathize, feel the pain that's being expressed by the poet. But also think about this final poem being the conclusion, and how we should maybe think of it as the conclusion in the midst, in light of the other poems up to this point in Lamentations. Lamentations 5. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our reproach. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to aliens. We have become orphans without a father. Our mothers are like widows. We have to pay for our drinking water. Our wood comes to us at a price. Our pursuers are at our necks. We are worn out. There is no rest for us. We have submitted to Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. Our fathers sinned and are no more. It is we who have borne their iniquities. Slaves rule over us. There is no one to deliver us from their hand. We get our bread at the risk of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Our skin has become as hot as an oven because of the burning heat of famine. They ravished the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. Princes were hung by their hands. Elders were not respected. Young men worked at the grinding mill. Youths stumbled under loads of wood. Elders are gone from the gate, young men from their music. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this, our heart is faint. Because of these things, our eyes are dim. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, foxes prowl in it. You, O Lord, rule forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to you, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are exceedingly angry with us. Okay, let's run through a few things here. I think we should have about 5-10 minutes left. Does that sound about right? 10 minutes. And so let's run through there's some things here, and then we'll end with maybe a discussion of this final poem here. But a call on God. Remember that memory is an important part of Lamentations. I didn't see anything in chapter 4, but other than that, I think every poem at some point uses the language of remembering or forgetting or calling to mind. And the book of Lamentations revolves around this idea of remembering both what happened to Jerusalem, how horrible that was, remembering the pain of the suffering, but ultimately remembering God in the midst of the suffering. But here in Lamentations 5, the call is on God to remember. Remember what has happened to us. Look and see our reproach. Remember, I'll remind you that in Exodus, this was the language used at the beginning of Exodus when the people cry out to God in slavery. It says that he remembered the covenant, that he saw the affliction, he remembered the covenant he had made, and then he acts. This is not a God saying, "Oh, I forgot, and you reminded me." This is remembering in God's world is to act on something he has said before. And to see what is happening and to act based on his promises. So this is the call on God to remember, see the shame that we are experiencing. And so you could read that. I mean, the pain here in verses 2 to 10, notice how the poet describes how they no longer belong, even in their own land. They have to pay for water, they have to pay for wood. They are submitted to these people. Slaves rule over them. They are no longer autonomous in their own land. They are ruled over and made to be outcasts and orphans and widows, and are living a life of fugitive as if in the wilderness. Again, I think the verses are wrong on here, but in verse 7, our fathers sinned and are no more. It is we who have borne their iniquities. The poet will say later on in this same poem that their sin is the reason this has happened. Verse 16, woe to us for we have sinned. So I don't think verse 7, I don't think verse 7 is a blaming of the previous generation for their condition. Okay, I think if you put verse 6 and verse 7 and verse 16 together, you get the phrase I've used is generational sin. I think the poet is looking back and saying, this thing has snowballed. The unfaithfulness, the wickedness of this people has just built and brought on an unbearable burden on us, and we are, wasting away under the weight of that sin, which has been passed down from generation to generation. But everyone suffers. You see in those verses 11 to 16. Every kind of strata or every kind of person in the demographics of society, princes, elders, young men, women, virgins, they're all mentioned there, suffering. And again, they confess, we have sinned and our life is wasting away because of that. Our joy it has ceased. Our dancing has been turned into mourning, an exact opposite of what the psalmist says in Psalm 30, verse 11, saying that our mourning has been turned into dancing. Here the opposite has happened, and the people are suffering. And so we end with this. This is the final word of Lamentations, a final plea to God, and says, you reign forever. So acknowledgement of God's rule in verse 19. Your throne is from generation to generation. Why, a question in verse 20, why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so long? A plea in verse 21, restore us to you, renew us in the days of old. And a kind of a qualifier at the very end in verse 22. The final word is to say, unless, this is our plea to you, unless you have rejected us completely or are exceedingly angry with us. And that's it. That's the end of the book, end of the poem. So what do you make of this? What do you make of this as the conclusion of the book? And as I asked before we read it, placing chapter 5 at the end of the whole book of Lamentations, how are we to understand this as the conclusion? What is the kind of final word of Lamentations? So Brian says that the book ends with the people having received their just punishment, now calling out to God to be restored. He says he doesn't see an explicit expression of penitence, but he says that just the call itself implies that sort of attitude. Robert, what do you want to add to that? Okay, so Robert says this is a bridge, using the layout of Scripture, a bridge from Jeremiah to Ezekiel, an acknowledgement of the generational sin, but this reflectiveness is what sets up the possibility of restoration in the future. Albert, what do you have? So Albert mentions in verse 22, and he mentioned his phrase kind of in connection to that is "Thy will be done." So this has happened to us. We understand that we deserved it, but it ends with this. We want this restoration, but it's up to you. Kind of is the idea. I'm curious. Let's talk more about 22 because we're out of time almost. So here's the interesting thing, Albert, about verse 22. A lot of the Hebrew manuscripts that come, especially the ones that come later. The way it's copied down at the end of Lamentations, they put verse 21, verse 22, and then they repeat verse 21 again. And it seemed like that was the way they had come to read it. And it's almost like they couldn't bear to end on verse 22. Verse 22 was like it was too much like, sad or something. And so they say, well, we'll just repeat 21 to kind of end it on a more happy note or something. But that's not the way it was intended to be. I mean, verse 22 is supposed to be the end. So what do we make of that? And Albert describes a kind of an attitude here of he didn't use the word humility, but if you may, I would use the word humility to describe the attitude that Albert's describing, which I think is important. I may have more to say on that, but Steve, you had... Yeah, but verse 22, I think, so a couple things I'll say about before we close. One is to kind of, to reiterate some of the things that Albert was saying. And I'll leave this open-ended to you. You can think about it. I could be wrong. I guess I'm not even really saying anything. I'm just asking a question. I understand that we are supposed to have boldness and confidence with the blood of Christ to go before the throne of God and ask for forgiveness. We should be confident to do that regardless of their sins. But I guess my question is there a danger, or at what point do we become demanding and have an attitude of, well, I deserve to be forgiven. You said you were going to forgive me, you better forgive me. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's like taking it for granted that God, just kind of assuming or taking for granted that he's going to offer us forgiveness. And so, again, it's a little bit of a puffed up type of mindset. And maybe we need, as Albert's describing, a humility of Lamentations 5:22 to say, in the end, it's not me that can demand God's forgiveness. It is by the grace of God. It is at great pain that God has brought about the opportunity for me to be forgiven by the blood of Jesus. And so I will never take that lightly. I will never take it for granted. I will never take advantage of that. And I will always say, thy will be done, and I don't deserve it. I have sinned, and I'm asking for forgiveness, and I'm confident in the blood of Christ, and I have confidence to stand up again under his power, with his power, and keep going forward. But I'm always going to retain that humility that says, it's God, it's you, it's not me. And I'm not demanding, I cannot be demanding of anything. And then I'll say one more thing before we're done, which is that remember that chapter 3 still stands as the center point. So yes, I think there is kind of a conclusion in chapter 5. There is a final word, but that final word is supposed to be heard in light of the center point of the book in chapter 3. So chapter 5 ends with somewhat of a somber note of, please restore us unless you've rejected us completely. But remember that, or don't read that isolated from the statements of chapter 3 when the poet said, "This therefore I have hope, that the Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, his compassions never fail, they are new every morning, great is your faithfulness." That I think is, although it's in the middle, I think it is the final word of Lamentations. And that plea, that somber plea at the end of chapter 5 is a harmony, maybe in a minor key, but it's a harmony to that statement of trust in God's faithful love in chapter 3. So that's Lamentations. And we will do some sort of review on Wednesday, but we're done. So thank you.